again, Yarny friends. My name is Angela from Yarn Church, and I'm here with my cat Sophia with a great episode all about swatching. In this episode, I'll talk about my top 5 reasons that I love to swatch, some of the benefits of swatching, as well as some tips for how you can be more successful in swatching for your projects. So my number one reason why I love to swatch is that I love to knit, and I don't really think of it as a waste of time to swatch because it's just more time with my hobby. I love feeling the yarn in my hands, and I just love the experience of knitting, and remembering that the experience of swatching is the experience of knitting helps me to really enjoy and look forward to swatching. The second reason why I really like to swatch is that it gives me a keepsake of the project. Most of the knitting I do is for myself, but I do some knitting for other people, some gift knitting. And sometimes when you're knitting a project and you give it away, you don't have anything left to enjoy of the project and remember like all of that time you spent. One of the big projects I did last year, I think it took me close to 8 months to knit an Agnet cardigan for my mother. This was a DK weight brioche cardigan that was definitely a labor of love. And I love that I still have the swatch from that I can kind of look back on the project. My mom lives across the country from me. I don't get to see her very often, and knowing I've got basically a little piece of her sweater here with me in my apartment. I keep all of my swatches in a plastic bag. I actually haven't been swatching for that long for projects. So this bag is not very full, but I keep all of my swatches as kind of keepsakes of the project or keepsakes of the yarn. It's maybe a nicer way to keep yarn in a swatch instead of just like rolled up into a ball. This is my swatch, for example, from my recent book club cardigan. And I love being able to look back easily on all of these projects just through my stash bag. It's like a little souvenir bag. The third reason why I love to swatch is it really helps me to be more creative. It takes a lot of the risk out of starting a new project or working on like a larger project because it's just a swatch. It's a small piece. There's not a lot of pressure to make it perfect because it's not really the finished object. It's just for me. Even if the final product is going to be a gift knit, the final product of a swatch is a swatch for me. And it's much smaller, so if I do waste the yarn, I'm not spending a ton of yarn on the swatch. In most cases, you can just frog the yarn, but in some cases, you really can't frog the yarn. And that case, maybe if you're practicing steeking for the first time, if you've never steeked anything, it feels very risky the first time you steek. And if the first time you steek is on a sweater that you've already spent months knitting, you may not want to take scissors to that. And how do you convince yourself that it's going to be okay to cut through this fabric that you just spent that so long knitting? Why not spend 30 minutes or an hour knitting a small swatch that you can reinforce or practice different ways of reinforcing and then cut it up in different places instead of doing that practice and rehearsal on your big project that you've already invested a lot of time on. You can invest a little bit of time on a swatch, and then if you mess it up, you're not out very much. The other things that I like to practice on swatches are new techniques like steeking, or one of my friends in one of my knitting groups recently, she's never picked up stitches before, and she has a sweater that she's been knitting, and she asked me, how would I pick up stitches for the neckline? And I showed her on her neckline, but I said, if you really want to get practice in, why don't you take your swatch that you knit for this project, assuming that she knit a swatch for the project, You can take the swatch that you knit for this project and just pick up stitches along the edge of the swatch. See how you like it. Does it look good? Does it look neat? Do you like picking up stitches with kind of two in the V's with kind of two strands? Do you like one strand? Do you like the strand in the front? Do you like the strand in the back? Do you want to go maybe down a row and have like a little bit more of a seam there? What do you like? You can try out a lot of different things because a swatch is small, so it doesn't take very long. And you've got two edges, so you have two different places to practice. And it's very easy and low commitment to just take it all out. You can use a swatch to practice casting on and binding off in different ways. Maybe you want to audition a new cast on for a project and see how that looks with the stitch pattern that you have in your project. Or same thing with the bind off. Is the bind off going to be stretchy enough? Does it make it flare out? The edges are emphasized in a swatch, and so if you want to see how a certain selvage will look on a project, and you're going to be able to see that really well in a swatch because, like I said, the edges are emphasized. Any issues with the edge or any beauty of the edge, the smaller the swatch, the more of the swatch is an edge. And so you can really emphasize that and see, kind of test that out. The third thing that I like about swatching is it gives me an opportunity to experience the yarn. Some of the things that I try to experiment with and experience with the yarn, it's not just about the gauge. It's about, do I like knitting with the yarn? How do the colors evolve in the yarn? Is it going to be a strong enough yarn for the project that I have in mind? One of the things you can do with your swatch is you can kind of wear the swatch next to your skin if you're concerned about maybe the texture of it. You could, for a sock, you put the swatch at the bottom of your shoe and walk on it for a little bit and see, like, does that texture of the purl stitches bother you? Or maybe first time sock wearer, or maybe you're not sure if a yarn or a yarn combination that you're using is appropriate for next to skin. You can kind of tuck it in to your collar and see, like, again, next to your skin, and see, well, how does that feel? Maybe you can wear it like that during a day and see, like, well, how does that feel next to my skin after a long time? And as it heats up, and really give it that kind of test drive. I've also heard of people putting their swatch in a project bag or in their purse, or maybe in your pocket, and a place that's going to get a lot of friction from your hands or from other objects, and kind of giving it a test to see, like, is this going to pill? Is this yarn going to wear out over time? And giving it kind of that test drive. And the final reason why I like swatching is maybe the reason that motivates most people who swatch for projects is the final project just turns out better. Now, this is a good transition into, how do you make your swatch more valuable for a project? My number one tip for success with swatching is not to skimp. Make sure you're making a nice big swatch. Remember, you can always frog it. Unless you've steeked the swatch, you can always frog the swatch if you need more yarn. Swatches generally don't take a ton of yarn. Even if you make a nice big one, I like to make sure I've budget in to my yarn budget for a swatch, so that I don't have to re-knit my sweater or my shawl or my hat. I really like to test, make sure I'm getting on gauge or getting close to gauge, or even if I'm not on gauge, at least that I know what my gauge is, and I know what that fabric is going to look like before I get, maybe cast on 300 stitches and get enough of that knit. That's a lot of frogging. That's a lot of frogged yarn. And by that point, the frogged yarn has been in there for a day or two or a week. And it's going to have those kinks in it, and it's not going to knit the same. Whereas if you knit a swatch, you can kind of get a look ahead. If you need to frog it, you can still frog it right right up front, because it doesn't take that long to knit a swatch. And you can get a feel for what your fabric's going to look like, what your gauge is going to be. Even if you don't get on gauge, you can kind of do some calculations and see like, well, what will this stitch count give me in terms of circumference of the sweater? What does it give me as far as, drop from the shoulder to the bottom of the armhole? Is that going to be good for me? You can do those calculations if you know what your gauge is. And so making that big gauge swatch, the bigger that is, the more accurate your gauge is going to be. So some of the reasons that a large gauge swatch will improve that accuracy. I'm borrowing a little bit of an example that Sari Nordland gave during the Canmore retreat that I went to in February. She said, imagine that you're trying to figure out how many steps it takes you to walk a mile, and you can walk across a room. If you walk across a large room and you count your steps and you know how long the room is, you're going to get a more accurate idea of how many steps it takes for you to get to a mile than if you only walk across maybe like a small area rug in the same room. And the reason for that is when you get kind of to the edges of something, you have edge effects, and you have edge effects in your knitting just as much as you have, maybe even more so than you have in the room. You may slow down as you get to the wall, and the same thing goes when you're knitting. The edge stitches, they're probably a little looser or a little bit tighter than the rest of the stitches, depending on what you're doing at the edge. If you're slipping a stitch, if you're maybe carrying a float at the back, for if you're trying to swatch in the round, which I'll get to a little bit later, how to do that, or different ways to do that. But when you don't want to ever be measuring at the edges, and the smaller your swatch, the more of your swatch is edge. And so the larger your swatch, the more accurate your gauge. My second tip with being successful with swatching is to be mindful of what kind of selvage you're putting on your swatch. It may be very tempting to always put garter at the edges so that your final swatch looks pretty and flat, but the point of the swatch is not to make a pretty swatch. The point of the swatch is to know your gauge. And maybe the point of making your swatch is to make a pretty swatch, in which case go ahead and put the garter on there. I definitely have swatches where I just wanted to see what the yarn would do and what the yarn would look like and have the swatch to keep. And I put garter on the edges of those so that it lays nice and pretty and flat. But if the purpose of your gauge swatch is to measure your gauge and know what your gauge is, putting garter, if it's not already in garter, on the edge, it can influence your row gauge, and you won't get as accurate a picture of what your actual row gauge for your project will be. In Patty Lyon's Knitting Bag of Tricks, she talks about this, and this is a tip that she gave, because really when you're measuring your gauge swatch, you want your swatch to be so reflective of your project. It's as if you maybe took your final project and cut a square out of it and measured from there. And you get closer to that by just doing the stitch pattern directly from the pattern, and not trying to add selvage or change anything. On that note, the third tip is to do the same thing to your swatch that you're going to do to your final project. That means that you're going to block it. If you're ever going to wash your finished project, you do want to wash your swatch. Now, I don't typically block my swatches very aggressively unless it's lace, because I don't typically block my finished objects very aggressively unless they are lace. And I know that when I'm washing my sweaters, I am typically just washing them. I'm just soaking them. Usually I'll spin them dry in the washing machine, and then I will put them out flat to dry on a sweater dryer, one of those mesh shelves that you can spread your sweater out, and I just kind of zhuzh it with my hands until it lays flat, doesn't have a lot of wrinkles in it. I may kind of rub with my hands and make sure that the ribbing is like laying flat, because sometimes that has a tendency to kind of flip, especially if you don't go down a needle size. Those are some of the things that I do, but I don't usually pin sweaters out. And so if I'm swatching for a sweater, I don't pin the swatch out for the sweater. If I'm going to use wooden needles for my final object, finished object, I'm going to use wooden needles for my swatch. I'm going to use metal needles for my finished object. I'm going to use metal needles for my swatch. And maybe while I'm swatching, I start using wooden needles and I decide, oh, I don't like that. I don't like the way that feels with the yarn. And then that's a good time to switch it out. And you can that's the right time to discover that, ooh, I don't like knitting with this needle, with this yarn, or I don't like this needle with this stitch pattern. The swatch is definitely the place that you want to find that out, and not, start knitting your project and switch needles partially through. That is going to mean that your gauge is changing throughout your project, and it's going to look less consistent because of that. Likewise, when you are swatching, make sure that you're also using the same technique. If you are knitting in the round for your project, you need to knit in the round for the swatch. And there are many projects like sweaters where you may knit part of it flat and part of it in the round. And in that case, you should do both. Sometimes I will do two separate swatches, and sometimes I'll use the method I'm going to show you to swatch in the round without joining in the round. And I will do the in the round section with one of those techniques. I'll do a purl bump or something to delineate the two sections, and then I'll do the rest of it back and forth. And so I'll have two swatches in one. The advantages of this is you don't have breaks in the yarn, and so if you do end up needing to frog it, you can just frog one piece of yarn and not have quite so many ends to weave in at the end. Speaking of knitting in the round without joining in the round, I've made a little video tutorial of two different methods for how to do that. Today I'm going to be swatching with some yarn that I made from leftover singles from sheep to shawl, and this is white undyed Romney wool. We'll start by doing a long tail cast on using a circular needle. The reason it needs to be a circular needle is because it needs to be a big enough swatch that you can measure your gauge without using the edges. So, long tail cast on. And I am not going to make a large enough swatch. I'm going to make a very small swatch for the purposes of demonstration, but in reality, if you're doing this as a gauge swatch, you would want this to be much, much larger than this. So if you were to swatch this flat, you would want to turn this around and purl across all of these stitches, because this is the purl side of a long tail cast on, and this is the knit side of a long tail cast on. So what we'll do is we would actually want to be knitting into this stitch. So to knit into this stitch, we need all of the stitches. We need this to be on the other end of the needle. So we'll pull it over to the other end. And now that it's on the other end, the other problem that we see is that the yarn is on the wrong side of the stitches. So now to move the yarn onto the other side of the stitches, you just pull it on over. And I would do this just like you would do when you're knitting color work. You want a very long float in the back. And you can do that the way that you do in color work by spreading your stitches way, way out and then doing the float. Or you can just, make sure, stick your finger in there, make sure it's nice and long. So I like to anchor the float kind of with my right hand a little bit, and then knit into the first stitch here. And once you've got the first couple of stitches down, you don't really have to worry about anchoring the float anymore. It's pretty anchored in place by the knit stitches. So knit across all of these stitches. Now, if we want to do this again, we will move it over to the right. And I'll demonstrate this one more time, continental style, and then I'll show you English style. So we'll spread our stitches out, make our long float, and float, and start knitting. And something you may notice with this method is that the first stitch and the last stitch can get really loose, especially if you make your floats long enough. I tend to not make my floats long enough using this method, which is why I usually use the second method I'm going to show you today for knitting swatches in the round without joining in the round. And so the way to kind of tighten this up and combat this is to knit the first and last stitch through the back loop. So I'll start doing that now as I demonstrate the English style, and then going forward I'll be knitting the stitches that tend to get loose through the back loop to kind of twist them and hold them in place. So English style, it's the same thing. You make your nice long float, except instead of holding the free yarn, the working yarn with your left hand, you're going to hold the working yarn with your right. This is almost a little bit easier because you can kind of hold your, with English style, you can just hold that float with your left hand because you're holding the free yarn with your right hand. Frees up that left hand to hold the float in place. And I forgot to knit that through the back loop. We'll definitely do it on the last stitch. Next time around, I'll try to remember. It's not really a big deal if you don't knit through the back loop, because remember, your swatch should be big enough that you're not using the first and last stitch. You're really not using that end inch and see, I am knitting through the back loop. You're not using that first and last little bit to measure your swatch at all. In fact, everything that I've got on my needles today, right now, would actually be excluded when I'm measuring a swatch, because all I have is ends here. So it's going to exacerbate, or it's going to emphasize any issues that you might have at the edges, because this swatch is basically all edges because of how small it is. And keep that in mind when you're deciding how big your swatch needs to be. So once again, I will measure my nice long float. I'll hold the float in place with my left hand, and then I will knit the first stitch through the back loop, English style. And then the rest of the stitches I will knit normally. Until the last stitch, and then I will knit that through the back loop as well. So that tightens up the edges a little bit if you want them to look a little bit neater, but like I said, it doesn't really matter because you're going to be, in a real swatch, you're excluding the edges. So the other method, instead of having all of the floats in the back, we'll have a loop on just the left side. So just like the other method, we do need to move the stitches over to the other side of the needle, of the circular needle. But instead of making a long float that we keep in the back, we're actually going to use this yarn that's attached on the left to knit all of the stitches. So we need to measure how much yarn it's going to take. So usually that's about 3 3 times the width of your swatch. So there's 3 times the width of my swatch, but this is how much yarn it's going to take. But in reality, your fingers need to be able to hold that yarn. And so I like to give myself a little bit extra beyond that. So there's my extra. And continental style, I am going to tension the loose yarn with my right hand and hold the loop with my left hand. And the other thing you want to make sure with this method is that the loop is on top. And the yarn coming from the yarn ball is underneath. If it's the other way around, you will trap the yarn ball yarn inside this loop, and you will end up with a mess. It defeats the purpose, some of the purpose of this method, and it defeats some of the advantages of this method. One of the advantages of this method is I don't really need to do that knit through the back loop thing on this side because there's not a lot of extra yarn on this side to manage and to let that stitch get loosey-goosey. So I don't knit through the back loop on the first stitch. I only knit through the back loop on the last stitch. So I'm knitting across using that loop, and then knit through the back loop on the last stitch. And now what we have is a loop on this side and nothing in the back on this row. And the other thing that you may notice is that the yarn attached to the right side is the yarn ball yarn. So we actually only have to do this measurement once every other row. We don't have to do it every single row. So I'm just going to move my yarn over to the right. And now I don't have to knit anything through the back loop, and I don't have to measure any yarn. I just knit this normally because this is kind of our, we're already at the right side of the work, everything. So we just have to scoot the stitches over and go. Definitely a convenience of this method. Right. And now I'll show you one more time continental style and then once English style. So measure the yarn, actually find the yarn that is coming from the yarn ball and measure 1, 2, 3, and a little bit extra. Tension with the right, with the other hand, I should say, and start knitting across with that loop. knit across like normal. Knit across like normal. And then scoot over. I'll show you one more time English style, and then we'll talk about it. So I'll measure the yarn, 1, 2, 3, a little extra. Make sure the loop's on top. Hold the non-working yarn with your left hand, and then knit with using the loop yarn with your right hand. My goodness. Believe it or not, I'm actually right-handed, but I don't feel very right-handed when I'm knitting English style. It's been a while since I've done, two-handed color work. When I've been doing two-handed color work, I get to be a little bit more proficient in English style knitting, and it's just been a while, so it's good to dust off those skills. I also find that I need a little bit extra working yarn going through the last stitch through the back loop. I do usually need a little bit extra working yarn when I'm knitting English style, so I try to make that loop a little bit bigger. But this was long enough, but that was maybe a little bit on the uncomfortable side, especially that last stitch. So I think, if I were to do another couple rounds of this, I would make sure that I gave myself more yarn to work with the next time around. Some of the things you may notice about this swatch, particularly the rows that have this long loop just at one side, is the swatch starts to get maybe a little bit lopsided, because this side has pretty normal tension, just like you would have in a kind of a stockinette swatch. And this side, because there's excess yarn just on this side, that you'll notice this end stitch especially is really loose. And the gauge is a little bit different on this side and on this side, but your gauge is always different.